Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where we discuss everything in the world of fantasy football. As always, I'm your host, Jeremiah, and I'm back again. Well, the Jacksonville Jaguars made a trade. They shipped Julius Thomas from Jacksonville to Miami, and now Julius Thomas is now a member of the Miami Dolphins. And, you know, the Miami Dolphins have been little bit busy this offseason. You know, from a defensive standpoint, they cut Marlon Williams, Earl Mitchell, who will generate some free agency interest. But Julius Thomas, man, ever since he stepped foot on the field as a member of the Jacksonville Jaguars, he has not been the same guy he was in Denver. And of course, you know, when he was in Denver, he was playing with Peyton Manning, who had the best season for a quarterback ever in the history of the NFL in 2013. And in 2014, of course, he was still playing with Peyton Manning, who was still playing at an elite level. But now, once I look at Julius Thomas here, he's going on a team with Ryan Tannehill, who is, I think, is an upgrade from Blake Bortles. Blake Bortles was a horrendous quarterback last season. And don't get me wrong, he's not going to have like the same type of year he's had with Denver Broncos. But when Julius Thomas was with Denver and the offensive coordinator was Adam Gase, who is now the head coach for the Miami Dolphins. So Thomas is familiar with Gase's system. So I do think there's some optimism to look for there. But Thomas had the best 2 seasons of his career in Denver from 2013 and 14. He was one of the productive tight ends in fantasy. Thomas had 108 receptions for 1,277 yards and 24 touchdowns over that 2-year stretch. So I do think there's some optimism there. I do think if he does stay healthy, he will be really great. And that is another problem that Thomas ran into in Jacksonville, was his inability to stay on the field and to be productive. There was many things why Thomas didn't work in Jacksonville. You know, his injuries, the quarterback play, whole lot. But I just think that the Jaguars just didn't. I think they missed out on Thomas. They didn't get what they paid for. They signed Thomas to a 5-year contract that was worth $46 million. There was $24 guaranteed. They signed Julius Thomas 2 years ago in March. So he didn't make any impact at all. The Jaguars got as much out of Neil Sterling and Ben Kayak, who caught 29 catches and 271 yards combined. Those two players made Julius Thomas expandable. So when you look at Neil Sterling and Ben Kayak, who had 29 catches for 271 yards combined, Julius Thomas only had 281 yards and 30 receptions total. So it looks like they were getting production elsewhere. And, Julius Thomas looked like he was hitting on the right track. And, Thomas caught 9 passes for 135 yards and touchdowns in his first 2 games this year. So he looked like he was pretty much on a good track there. But he didn't catch more than 3 passes in a single game. He only did that just once and didn't have more than 28 yards receiving in any game ever since. So in the 9 games that he played, he had his worst season ever. So there was many things that were alluded to his days in Jacksonville. He missed a total of 11 games. Like I said earlier, he struggled with injuries. Blake Bortles was probably one of the main reasons why Thomas wasn't productive. In 2 seasons with the Jaguars, Thomas has 76 catches for 736 yards and 9 touchdowns, which is less than 10 yards per catch. He averaged 11.8 yards per catch and 24 touchdowns in Denver. So it's clear to me that Julius Thomas is valuable with a good offensive system. He was not nearly... I didn't think he was going to be as productive in Jacksonville when he first signed that deal than he would be in Denver. So I think he will move up in the rankings as far as tight end goes. When you look at his targets, he only had 52 targets. I think those will be driven up heading to this year. And when I look at the whole entire, tight end position here in fantasy, of course, Rob Gronkowski is going to be the number 1 ranked tight end there. And if Gronk he's still healthy, then he will be the best tight end, I think, in my opinion, in fantasy. But, you got Jordan Reed, who is taken, in the middle rounds. You got Greg Olsen, got Travis Kelce, Delaney Walker. Kyle Rudolph was even productive, who went undrafted. So, when I looked at the top targeted tight ends heading to this season, Julius Thomas is not one of them, but I do think he has a chance to re-solidify his career. And Julius Thomas is only 27 years old, so he's still young enough to be productive. He's about to enter his 7th season. And when I looked at the entire tight end position heading into 2017, I do think it's someone, you have to get someone who is going to hog up a lot of targets. You got to get someone that has to hog up a lot of targets. Kyle Rudolph, I do think he was a very valuable tight end. He had the most targets in the tight end position. He was the most targeted tight end in fantasy. He had 132. He finished with 83 receptions. Then you got Greg Olsen, who was targeted 129 times. You got Dennis Pitta, who had a resurgent season. Finished with 121 targets. They got Travis Kelce with 117, who I think ended up being the best tight end in fantasy due to Gronkowski's injury. But I do think Kelce is the second best tight end in fantasy for 2017. You got Zach Ertz, who I think is going to be even better. Delaney Walker, 102. And you got Jimmy Graham, Jason Witten, Gates as, that rounds out the list in around the 90s. And when I look at this tight end list, CJ Fedorowicz actually had 89 targets. He tied it with Jordan Reed. So, what I'm saying is you got to look at tight ends that will hog up a lot of targets. And I don't know if Julius Thomas, not Julius, I don't know why I called him Julius. I don't think Julius Thomas will hog up a lot of targets for the Dolphins. They do have Jarvis Landry there. They got Devontae Parker. They can potentially bring back Kenny Stills. So they have so much talent there already. So where's Julius Thomas' targets going to come from? So I do think they have 2 solid receivers there that Ryan Tannehill loves to throw to. But I just don't think he will get as much targets as these other guys. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong. But I'm saying I think you got to lower your expectation on Julius Thomas and drafts. I do think there's a lot of better options out there. And, in fantasy last year, Greg Olsen and Kelsey were the only 2 tight ends with more than 1,000 yards receiving. So, I do think in fantasy, you got to find guys that hog up a lot of targets and hog up a lot of touchdowns. They got to be touchdown dependent. They got to hog up a lot of targets in the end zone. And I do think that Cameron Brate and Hunter Henry, they are valuable in that aspect. But I do think for Dorwitz, he was pretty valuable because of that aspect. You got Jimmy Graham, who was valuable in that. And when Julius Thomas was pretty much one of the best tight ends in fantasy, he had a lot of end zone targets. He had 12 touchdowns in each of those 2 seasons in Denver. And he only had 9 total in Jacksonville. So I do think when you're drafting a quarterback or when you're looking to who the best tight end is, I think Julius Thomas is someone you might have to stay away from because there's so much talent in Miami, I think, on the offensive side of the ball that I don't know if Julius Thomas is going to get as much targets as the other guys in the league. But I do think his stock is risen up. I do think he will be better than he would be in Jacksonville. I don't think he'll be as good as Denver, but maybe I might be wrong about that. But I do think he will be a whole lot better than what he will be in Jacksonville. I do think he will be good for the Dolphins if he stays healthy and if they put him in position to make plays. But I'm going to take my first break here. And when I get back, I'm actually going to discuss running back legend. A legend for the Cowboys, so to speak. He has some comments about Ezekiel Elliott and the potential resurgence of the running back position. So I'm going to talk about the running back position and Herschel Walker's comments from a fantasy football perspective when I get back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Well, the Cowboys had a really great year, or should I say a very resurgent year. They had a really good resurgence. They finished 4-12 in 2015. In 2016, they went to 13-3 to gain the top seed in the NFC. But that was maybe partly due to Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott. And Ezekiel Elliott was among the top fantasy running backs this year. And Herschel Walker, a Cowboys legend, did talk about Elliott's rookie season. And he talked about maybe the possibility of a resurgence of the running back position. Well, Herschel Walker was presented with the Doak Walker Legacy Award on Saturday and spoke about the league's running back renaissance. So, according to Dallas Morning News, Herschel Walker said, quote, "Even though they talk about the West Coast offense and all this stuff, to be honest, whenever you want to win the Super Bowl, who do you go to? The running back. Because you can pass the ball all you want to do. But when you want to win the game, you better be able to run the ball and you better have that running back." And honestly, I have to agree with him on that. I have to agree to win football games. You got to have a really great running back. But, this is a quarterback-driven league. And I do think that the quarterbacks are more valuable than running backs. But from a fantasy perspective, I think the running back position is more valuable than the quarterback position. I truly do think so. When you have running backs that gain a lot of carries, let's just say, Ezekiel, he was someone that was going to give you 20 points on a bad day. Le'Veon Bell, someone that will give you at least 20 points on a bad day, maybe 15. So I do think, when I think of the running back position from a fantasy standpoint, I think of someone that will be practically one of your top point getters on your team. So, you can have the best receiver in the NFL. You can have Julio Jones. You can have Odell Beckham Jr. If they're not giving you points, you got to rely on your running backs. And I do think Ezekiel Elliott, Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson were those guys this year. Jay Ajayi he became a valuable fantasy running back this year. And, I kind of had this, I kind of did this topic a little bit differently on the football show. But on this show, I have to do a little bit different perspective, because when you analyze football from a reality standpoint to a fantasy standpoint, it's a little bit different. But as far as a resurgence of the running back position, I think that may be a little bit of a reach, because, I can only probably consider 3 guys to be very valuable to their team. And those are guys I said, Ezekiel Elliott, you got Le'Veon Bell, and you got David Johnson. And, when Le'Veon Bell got hurt in the playoff game against the Patriots, that offense was not the same. And with David Johnson, I do think if he wasn't on that Cardinals team, I think the Cardinals would have had an even worse record. He was that valuable to that offense. And Ezekiel Elliott's not on this Cowboys team. I don't know if Dak Prescott would have the same type of year that he had. I think Dak Prescott would have been good, but I don't know if he would have been that well. I know he has a great offensive line, but if you see, you can clearly see the talent in Ezekiel Elliott when he runs the ball. But when you're talking about the running back position from a fantasy perspective, I do think they're very valuable. You have to get someone that's going to carry the rock at least 20 or 30 times. Ezekiel Elliott is that guy. And what I mean by touching the ball, I mean like running, carrying the ball, and I mean by catching the ball. And Ezekiel Elliott is one of those true 3-down backs. Le'Veon Bell is one of the most complete backs in the league, and David Johnson can take over the game in any way, shape, or form. But, when I look at the lower tier guys, like Jay Ajayi, he's someone that is an RB1 looking forward, because, he is someone that is very valuable to the Dolphins offense. Melvin Gordon looked like he had a breakout year. He's someone that could be very valuable for your team. I think Todd Gurley, I think he's going to have a bounce back year, so he can be very valuable for your team. So I do think if your team does not have a good running back, I don't know if you're going to be able to win your league. I don't think so. I don't know if you're going to be able to win your league. You got to get someone that's going to get you a lot of yards and with a lot of touches. And I don't know if there's a whole lot of guys to do that, but the running back position is very valuable in fantasy. Like, if you had to choose between one of the top receivers, Antonio Brown, and one of the top running backs, like Ezekiel Elliott and, Le'Veon Bell, I do think Antonio Brown is one of those exceptions that you take over maybe a potential running back, because Antonio Brown does so much for the Steelers offense. I feel like he's one of those players that does well no matter who is the quarterback. So he can probably be the only exception to that. But when you're drafting in the first round, you have to get that player that's going to pretty much be the star of your team, whether that's a receiver, whether that is a running back, or if that's Gronkowski, who I think could be a first rounder again. But you have to get a running back that will practically carry your team. I think lots of very good fantasy teams start at the running back position. But when you're talking about reality football, it all starts at the quarterback position. So it's a little different perspective than you have to take on. So I would say this, when you're in the first round, target the best player that will give you the most amount of points each week out of all those players. And I think if I had a top 3 pick, I think I would choose a running back. Me personally, I love running backs. I like drafting at least 4 every year because running backs tend to get hit the most and they tend to get hurt more than other position players. So I'm a guy that loves targeting multiple running backs. And me personally, I would take a running back with around the first 3 to 5 picks. If they're there already. That's the thing. It has to be the right value. Well, I'm going to take my last break here. Now I'm going to discuss the top free agents this offseason. And I'm going to try to analyze their potential teams that they will end up from a fantasy perspective when I get back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And, we're kind of almost at the free agency period and the beginning of the new league year. And I believe it starts on March 1st. So it's going to come up pretty soon. So I'm going to discuss the top, in my opinion, the top offensive free agents and where I think they will end up. And I will try to break, their fantasy value based on my prediction where they will end up this year. So the first, the top free agent who is said to be a free agent is Le'Veon Bell. I think he's just going to end up with the Steelers again. It's hard to imagine to let the Steelers let him test the mark. It's just hard for me. I don't think the Steelers will allow Le'Veon Bell to walk. I just can't see that. I think Le'Veon Bell has the potential. I think he's one of the best running backs. I think he is the best running back. I think he might be one of the best players in the NFL. He's one of those backs that can pretty much take over a game. So it's hard for me to imagine him go elsewhere. I think he's among the top 3, along with David Johnson and Ezekiel Elliott. He might be the best one of the 3. So it's hard to imagine him not being in a Steeler uniform next year. So I do think he will be with the Steelers again. And I think if he is back on that team, and I do think he will be back with the Steelers, he's a top 3 running. He's a top 3 pick. And if he does decide to not sign with the Steelers again for some reason, if he does test the free agent market, he's going to generate a lot of interest. And I think no matter where he plays, he will be a top 3 pick. I truly do. And the second, probably the highest on the list, is Kirk Cousins. And the reason why he's so high on this list is because he plays quarterback. Good quarterbacks rarely become free agents, and Cousins I think he is one of the mid-tier guys. On the football show, I did talk about him not signing a long-term deal before the franchise tag deadline, so I do expect him to be with Washington again on the franchise tag. But if he does test the free agent market, there are a lot of teams that are going to have a lot of interest. The 49ers are going to be one of those. I do think the Browns could be one of those teams, but, I don't see Kirk Cousins going to the Browns. So I do see him going to the 49ers basically because of Kyle Shanahan, and they can be a surprise team there. But I'm not so sure that he will be on the Redskins as much as I am so sure that Bell will be with the Steelers. I do think there's more of a chance of Kirk Cousins walking away from Washington than Le'Veon Bell will walk away from the Steelers. So I do think if Kirk Cousins remains with Washington, I do think his value would stay the same from a fantasy standpoint. But if he goes to the 49ers, I don't know if I can trust him. He will make that offense better, but I just don't think he would have the numbers that he would with Washington the past 2 years. The reason why I say that is this team, the 49ers, are not talented. No, there's not a lot of talent on that team. The Redskins, they had a lot of talent when he was there. Deshaun Jackson might walk. Pierre Garçon will probably walk. They still got Jordan Reed there, so he's not going to have as much offensive firepower as he would have the past couple years in Washington. But I do think if he remains in Washington, I do think he's still valuable as a fantasy quarterback. But I do think if he ends up with the 49ers, I think he's someone that you can probably try to get late, basically because of the team and the talent around him. But from that point, I think you just have to treat him as your second quarterback on the team. So, but if he remains with Washington, I do think he can be a QB1. And other players that are set to be free agents, I got 2 receivers and a tight end. Terrell Pryor is set to become a free agent. Martellus Bennett, tight end from the Patriots, is set to be a free agent. And Alshon Jeffrey is set to be a free agent, and he's probably going to not come back to Chicago. Best for Terrell Pryor, the Browns really want to keep him. They really like him as a receiver there. He was given a chance, because of injuries to Corey Coleman and, the suspension of Josh Brown. I think if he hits the market, he's going to have a lot of interest. I think he's going to want to have money as a number 1 receiver. Me, personally, I think Terrell Pryor is better suited as a number 2, but I do think he wants to be treated like a number 1 receiver. But I do think if he goes back to the Browns, I do think his value would be really high. I think you can treat him as your second or third receiver on your team. I think Corey Coleman's going to be really good next year. I don't know if Josh Gordon is going to come back and play again. So I do think Terrell Pryor is a very valuable receiver in fantasy next year. And if he happens to go to another team, I won't base his value yet because of that, because I don't know what team he will end up. But if he does go to another team, I would probably update you on his value because, values change depending on the scheme and the team that you're on. So the Browns, I do think he would still be productive in Cleveland, and I do think I'm kind of betting on him staying there. So I do think his value would be in the middle rounds as your receiver too. Martellus Bennett, I think he's going to walk. I don't think the Patriots are going to want to bring him back on another deal. They do have Gronk there. The Patriots are one of those guys that don't like to overpay for players because they can't. They have a lot of talent. They have a knack for finding talent. So I do think he's going to draw a lot of interest. I think he's a very talented tight end. I can see him going back to the Giants. I can see him going back to a team that needs a tight end. So he will generate some interest. I think if he goes to a team that utilizes the tight end position like a receiver, then he will be on the tight end radar. I can probably maybe going to Green Bay, but they got a lot of guys there. So it remains to be seen where Martellus Bennett goes. I do think if he goes to the right team, he can be a tight end 1. And for the final player on this list, I got Alshon Jeffrey, and I think he's going to not come back to Chicago. He's going to have a lot of interest, and he did have that 4-game suspension at the end of the 2016 season. It could hinder him, but this guy is a talent on the field. And I can actually see him going to a team in need for a receiver. I do think if Kirk Cousins does end up in San Francisco, I can see Alshon Jeffrey go there. I can see Alshon Jeffrey going to a variety of teams. But I don't think he's going to come back to Cleveland. That team is a mess. Even if the Bears get Jimmy Garoppolo, I think Alshon Jeffrey is done with that organization. Okay, well, that is going to conclude my show. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. You can catch the show on a variety of platforms every week. iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and on the website gsmcpodcast.com. You can also follow the show on multiple social media platforms. On Twitter, Instagram, the handle is at @GSMC_FFootball, and on Facebook, you can like us there at the Going to Meet Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. Well, Anthony will be back on Friday, and we'll discuss anything fantasy football relevant. And I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. I'll be back later this week, and you guys have a great day and have a pleasant tomorrow.